The strange pact of a socialite began with a gold parcel and a promise written like a threat. The house had everything to prove that nothing was lacking. Tall columns that threw afternoon shadows like steady hands, a piano that kept its place under a photograph of Ava in a gown so pale it looked lit from within, a cellar that smelled of cedar, and things kept because they might one day be needed. Yet the nights were not quiet. Curtains moved without wind, as if someone on the other side of the glass breathed too close. The stair complained with a voice that was almost human. The mantel clock struck with a hesitance, as if listening for an answer. When Ava held her newborn to her chest, small, hot, and perfect in the dimness, she measured every sound like a pulse, the infant's breath, a tiny bell, the house's inhalation, the distant city aura that never quite slept. She had learned to read the house as others read faces. There were rooms that sighed as if relieved, corners that kept secrets folded in the hems of rugs. That evening the study hummed low, a wrong note under the wallpaper, and the curtains in the nursery trembled though the panes were closed. Ava's hands, still recovering the motion of milk and lullaby, hovered over the baby's blanket. There was a comfort in the child's even breath, a small, relentless ordinary, yet that comfort made the house's stray gestures sharper. A photograph on the piano leaned as if someone had come and gone behind it. A drawer in the writing desk creaked open and shut like a throat clearing. When she discovered the parcel, it lay small as a bird on her threshold, wrapped in gold paper the color of coin shadow, the ribbon knotted with an economy she had seen before in hands that kept their own ledgers. There were no footprints in the hall. Rain had begun to smear the garden into a watercolor, and the wet under the eaves made the evening dimmer, like a room exhaling. She carried the parcel to the nursery because the house's moods were best named where the child slept. Inside she found tiny knit clothes folded with the kind of attention people reserve for things they want to keep invisible from the world. Folded within the smallest sleeve was a scrap of paper, the handwriting neither elegant nor unsteady, an address, then 3 lines that sat like a finger pointing in a closed fist. I'm always here. I will watch. I will love you till the end. Ava folded the paper between her fingers until it was no longer legible. The lines could be read as blessing or surveillance. They tasted like both. The gold wrapper, the neatness, the anonymity, everything about it felt like help delivered with a gloved hand. She had been helped before. Help arrived in the dark and neat places where society kept its favors. A donation that smoothed an overdue ledger entry, a whisper in a gallery that shifted a name toward invitation lists, a check that materialized like weather, on time and inexplicable. Those favors had one thing in common. They never asked to be named. They changed the sound of Ava's life, and they left no visible signature other than a quiet improvement in the household accounts and a reduced number of nights spent tallying threats. Still, the parcel unsettled her. Blessings with no sender are measures, not mercies, and she had a ledger inherited from her father that marked debts not only in dollars, but in tone. Her father, the man who kept a pencil behind his ear, had taught her that gratitude should arrive with accounting. Her mother had taught her that houses wanted caretakers, and that a child's laugh is proof against many small cruelties. Both lessons gnawed at the edges of the note. Who watched? For whom did this love ask to be the only tender thing in exchange? The baby slept with a softness that made Ava both brave and small, and she carried the parcel to the kitchen, where the brass kettle glowed like an accusation. She considered burning the paper. She thought of burning the ribbon, of torching the gold until the very idea of it was ash. Instead, she folded the scrap and tucked it into the pocket of her dressing gown, where it pressed against her like a pulse she could not quite name. If this kind of story, the ordinary sharpened by the strange, pulls at you, there are more like it. Consider subscribing. She could tell herself that the parcel was the work of a neighbor with too much time and too much sentiment, or of some admirer who preferred the edge of mystery to the roughness of a conversation. But Ava knew how favors worked. They were a thing that entered life sideways and stayed by the stove, a thing you could not always point at but which adjusted the hanging of every frame until the picture looked new. She watched the house for a week, and for a week it kept speaking in half phrases. The piano retuned itself at midnight, A stray vase would find itself centered on the sill. A letter of credit arrived with a bank's careless handwriting. Bills that should have dimpled her bankbook smoothed. Invitations came to the right events, envelopes with good news in them, a check in the post whose source was a nudge, and then silence. The world around her, meanwhile, continued its polite choreography. Neighbors invented small myths for the gold parcel, a well-wisher, a misdirected delivery, the kindness of a philanthropic stranger who preferred to remain nameless. They did what polite towns do with complexity. They simplified it. Ava's acquaintances took the tidy option and called it fortune. The house, however, kept speaking. It kept asking for a name to fit the new shape of its knights. The bargain that made the parcel possible did not unfold in boardrooms or at the offices of law firms. It happened in the kind of place the polite world removes from its postcards, a bank lobby with soft carpets and fluorescent lights that insist on the color of truth, a park bench under a stand of trees with an iron fence and a bench that remembered every whispered idea it had held. The night she made the bargain, she had come from a meeting that had ended with a polite, definitive shake of hands that meant loss. They had closed the file and handed her the ledger and the quiet sentence that said there was nothing more to do. She had been too young for failure, or at least she had never adjusted the grammar of her life to include it. The accounts of the household had been balanced by charm and social currency for years. Her father's careful arithmetic, her mother's skill at hosting, Ava's own face at benefit dinners, but a single, sharp fault can slide a well-polished life into a groove of necessity. There was a summons for payments, quiet at first, and then a drum. A friend called and said the names on the invitations had been misread and that there was nothing to be done. The ledger on her father's desk had a column she did not recognize. She walked the city with the thinness of someone whose pride had become an extra weight pressing at the back of her neck. In the park, she met the stranger. He sat with his coat pulled up against rain that had not yet fallen and a cap like a secret. He was not a man who advertised his offers. His hands, when they reached her to return a dropped glove, were not sticky with coin but were steady in a way the shopkeeper's hands were not. He spoke without the common insistence of people who make bargains. Slow, a voice that had long ago learned the economy of words. "You look like someone who wants to pretend the world is not asking," he said, and Ava, who had once learned the dance of appearing as if she had never needed an answer, did not laugh. He named nothing explicit. He offered instead a possibility in the shape of a favor. It would come in ways that were practical and discreet. It would arrive as help that made things right again. All he wanted, he said, was a sound, her voice, pledged quietly, an affirmation. No signature, no witness, nothing written but held. She remembers the feeling of agreeing like a small theft, the way the chest loosened at first, then buckled. Her voice made the promise as if it were a thing she could utter and put aside. There were no papers because no papers are tidy enough to hold what transactions between certain kinds of things require. A whispered yes is the kind of thing that can cross boundaries because it carries no legal weight, only intention. She told herself it was a practical trade, a single coin to restore balances. She told herself she would be careful. Money returned like tide. A timely donor, an auction item that fetched more than expected. A sponsor at the opera who took an interest in a cause Ava knew she could support elegantly. The house sighed in a different register. The curtains stopped their wandering, or so it seemed for a time. Yet the quiet that arrived afterward was a different species from peace. The gold parcel, when it arrived after Essie was born, carried with it an idea that generosity, when unaccountable, is often also a claim. Elsewhere, beyond streets smoothed by social customs and away from the tidy patterns of city life, other kinds of calculations were being made. There are places where debts are measured in shapes and tastes and the bending of a neck. There are communities that keep their rules on the mouths of those who govern them and make bargains in the language of bone and root. In a wood that smelled of wet stone and late moss, elders met in a ring of ancient trees whose roots had lived longer than any ledger. They were the sort of people who count the cost of gifts in ways different from merchants and bankers. Their voices were the kind that could name the life of a river and say who it belonged to. Doha lived in that liminal place, though to call him lived is already to bend a truth. He was not entirely of one world. In his coils the letters of trees were written, and in the flicker of his tongue the taste of human footsteps resounded. He had been called many things in the years that stretched before the elders convened, a thing of the undergrowth, a shape that could unpick a farmer's night-long traps and leave them only with the bite of superstition, a presence that hummed along the waterline when boats crept too near. The forest saw him as it sees rivers, present, consequential, necessary in its own quiet cycles. What made Doha different, what made him walk out of the shadows toward a set of elders with a question, was not greed or even resentment. It was a longing that is hard even to put in human terms, the wish to fit into a single room where a human could say his name and mean it, to have a touch that was not the caution of a hand when a wild thing is near. He had watched humans hug and make plans and speak names that stuck like sap to the air. He wanted to be named, and he wanted the tactile ordinariness of being counted in a census of small things, the paying of a baker, the candle stub left in a jar, the laundry folded and draped. It is a strange desire for something a river does not need, but not stranger than the way some humans will yearn for the sea. The elders listened. They were not indulgent. They are not the sort to speak a wish into being the way a child might blow out a candle. They considered the texture of the request, the body's needs, the cost of insertion into a crowded human world, the moral hazards of bringing a wild thing into a house that expects certain kinds of mercy and denies others. In the ring of trees they spoke rules that had the feel of a law and the softness of a dirge. You may be given flesh, the eldest said, fingers curled with the map of years. You may bend your spine to the heat of a hearth, but you will not keep all that was. There is price. You must chew the thing we offer at the mountain's mouth. The chewing will pull the river name from your throat. Forgetting will begin, a slow unthreading. What you have already placed in a human world may remain where it fell. It will not shift back into root. And when you are human, you will learn the small cruelties. Hunger, the need to buy bread, the weight of sleep that will not sleep you repair. Children will need dinners. Doors will need keys. You will not be held in shelter by enchantment. You will be merely mortal. Doha's body twitched like a string being tuned. The elders' terms were not soft. There was an arithmetic to them, a ledger of what was ceded and what was kept. He had thought to conjure a simpler exchange, entering a house and staying without the inconvenience of counting beans. The elders named what he had not allowed himself to ask. The treasures he had earlier bestowed upon strangers, shiny things left at thresholds, a string of coins that had once glowed in a half-buried hollow, would remain possessions in the houses where they had landed. They would not return to the forest, and they would not fill his hands again. Memory would be a cost, not a currency. It is important, the elders said, to mark their limits. Magic in those parts was patient and exacting. It did not erase moral responsibility. It offered forms and boundaries. Doha considered the terms the way a beast considers a trap, with the mixture of hunger and guile that living things possess. He had wanted to be close to humans for reasons that mattered to him in the dark. Warmth, touch, the cadence of names. But the elder's insistence made the wish precise. He wanted to be human enough to know what it was to be named, to watch a child breathe and not be an outsider to the small marvels in a nursery. He wanted to be addressed at dinner and asked whether an extra plate of stew might be had. The elders told him the costs, forgetting, obligations, the iron presence of daily bills, and he pressed his forehead to his coils and agreed. The ritual took place at the mountain's lip, where wind had learned to fall silent and where the world narrowed to the size of a single moment. The elders brought him an object wrapped in cloth, a knucklebone perhaps, or a carved shell whose grain ran like a map. They moved with the kind of precision that belongs to people who have rehearsed tenderness into ritual. Doha bit down on the object. It tasted of cold stone and rain, and as his teeth found the shape of it, the forest seemed to sigh as if releasing a held breath. For a while, the transformation was pain, folded into a kind of hunger. Scales loosened, like old leaves peeling from a tree, and the heat under the skin reformed into something else. The elders chanted in a language that did not translate into ordinary consolation. It mapped obligations. There was a sensation like a tide going out of the body's edges, memories loosening as though a comb were running through them, a river voice here, a flash of green there, the memory of a child's foot in mud somewhere distant. These fragments did not vanish so much as move to the periphery, become like objects placed in an attic where they could be visited seldom. Doha did not wake to find himself perfectly human in the sense that a tailor might make a suit fit a boy overnight. He woke with new limbs that responded oddly, and with a mind that ran like a house in which some rooms had been boarded over. He could feel hunger that required work to remedy. He could feel exhaustion that demanded wages. There was also a new tactile pleasure in the simple friction of fabric against skin, in the way a hand could be folded around another hand for warmth, but alongside these new joys there was the ache of losing an old continuity. The elders had not lied. The treasures he had once tipped into human thresholds would remain, and the forest would not receive them back. They spoke to him before he left. "You will forget in degrees," one said, "not all at once. You will wake to find a child's laughter pleasing and a flame simple to build. But you will also notice small blanks that make you start at mirrors, or at names called in the night. Keep tokens if you must, and lists. Keep moss in a pocket if it gives you anchor. But remember, the work of being human is not overturned by enchantment. Pay for bread. Hold a job. Tend a child. Belongingness is made at the level of daily things." Doha tucked a scrap of damp moss into a fold at the base of his skull, where he could touch it without being seen. It was a token that felt like a compass and a map, and he gripped it with a kind of devotion usually reserved for survivors. He understood, in a way that was not yet human speech, that he would need rituals of his own to keep name and night together. When he finally left the mountain, it was in a coat he had not chosen but had learned to wear. His footsteps were clumsy on human pathways, as if his joints were rediscovering directions. The first town he entered smelled of coal and soup and laundromats. He was a curiosity to some and invisible to others. He had to ask for work, to accept that his muscles could be traded for coin, to learn the timetables and the manners. He tasted the world differently, the bronze tang of money in his pocket, the need to plan meals, the odd and intimate economy of small talk in a queue. He brushed his palm along door frames and felt the house edge in a new way, less as threshold to trespass, and more as the thing that could keep a life inside its careful gravity. Yet forgetting did not proceed as the elders had prescribed in a straight line. Memory receded in pools and islands. One day he might wake and not remember the weave of rain through the birch. The next he would find his tongue naming a leaf he had not seen in dawn for months. He would dream of coils sometimes, waking startled at the image of his own hands. Sometimes, when the city sang at the margins and he was not yet learned enough to enter the hum of polite commerce, he would find himself at the edge of a park, where the sound of an iron bench felt like the echo of a prior life. He would touch the moss stitch in his pocket like a rosary, and feel for a name he could not quite hold. Meanwhile, in Ava's house, life reasserted itself in small, ordinary ways. Essie, Ava had named her for a grandmother who had been a woman of certain quiet virtues, slept through the loudest hours of the afternoon, and Ava, who had feared sleeplessness would tear the neatness of her life apart, learned the rhythms of diapers and soothed nights with the kind of devotion that makes a mother both tender and economical. The gold parcel, folded now into the drawer with spare nursing pads and a photograph of a hand that would one day be larger, remained a thing both to distrust and to thank. Rumor, as it does, began to take up the shape the neighbors favored. The parcel became a local romance, a secret courtship, a misdelivered order, the romantic generosity of a patron touched by the sight of a newborn. Ava learned to nod at such talk and to keep her own counsel, which was a ledger of another kind. An account of nights in which the curtains did not behave or did behave with the wrong kind of politeness, of a man's voice halting over a baby's bassinet. She measured the hush in terms of her own breathing and waited for a knock at her door that she could neither name as being promised nor being feared. In the meantime, Doha folded himself into the city by the most unromantic gate a human can pass through. Work. He found a small shop that wanted hands to help repair the things neighbors brought in broken. People brought kettle lids dented, chairs with wobbly legs, a clock that stopped mid-chime. He learned the apprentice's joy of returning an object to its proper measure. Fixing things returned to him the pleasure of a problem solved. It was, in its own way, a kind of right. People rewarded carefulness and a steady hand. For the first time he learned the economy of a wage, how it could be stretched and how it could not, the modest dignity of being paid for repair, the sensation of a coin pressed into the palm like a small warm stone. Yet there were nights when he woke with a scale on his skin that was not a scale, but a memory of how his own body had once been armored. He would find a green flake in his hair after sweeping the shop floor, and wonder if it had simply been a fleck from a customer's coat or a remnant from the mountain. He learned to hide his moss token in the shirt under his shirt, and to make lists, because lists are a human remedy against forgetting. He wrote names down, names of people who had shown him kindness, the routes of the bus he took, the order of steps in mending a kettle, and carried the lists like charms. Ava's evenings, the ones that had once been spent brushing a glove across a shelf, now had Essie taking up the center. The infant's small presence made the house's noises a theatrical ensemble rather than a verdict. A neighbor called with an invitation, and Ava found herself accepting. The social world opened with polite applause, but Ava noticed that where things had once been effortless, conversations, introductions, the little power plays of charity, they now required her to hold back a heartbeat because of what she had given with her voice. There was a ledger she could not fully account for. The nights she did not sleep and the price she could not name. And then, one rainy afternoon when curtains lifted like gauze and the house felt like an animal with an ache, there was a knock. It was not the knock of a door-to-door salesman, nor the thin, practiced tap of a social call. It was a slow, considered rap, the sort of knock one hears when someone uncertain of the borders between house and stranger is deciding whether to enter. The maid, who had worked for Ava since before Essie was born, and who had learned the grammar of hesitation in its most practical form, opened the door just a crack. The stranger at the threshold was not what any headline would have expected. A man of no costly clothes, neither ragged nor fine, with hands that seemed to have learned the geometry of repair, and a coat that wore its mending like a map. His eyes were the kind that notice edges. Ava, who had folded the scrap of gold note into her pocket many evenings ago and told herself she would set fire to it, found herself holding her son's breathing in a hand against her chest as she approached the doorway. A wave of something like recognition went through her, a ripple of that thin, interior radar people store for threats and promises. In the man's face something slid and settled, the shape of the ordinary as if he had been trying it on for the first time. He smiled with a kind of hesitant generosity. "Good afternoon," he said, voice careful. "My name is Doha." There are moments when the world shifts in the way the light falls between the shutters, and anyone who has ever lived inside a house knows the particular kind of hush that follows such a name. The house stopped its small complaints for the briefest of beats. For Ava, the name was a key that fit into a lock she hadn't known existed. It rang a bell that she had tucked away for reasons she could no longer entirely enumerate. She felt the gold scrap, hot in her pocket, as if it had been a coin pressed against a wound. She did not know where Doha had come from. She did not know what the elders had told him, or what he had had to chew at the mouth of a mountain. She did not yet know the shape of his past, and she could not have guessed how much of that past he had traded for the ability to put his hand on a doorframe and say a human name. In that small breath between the knock and the opening, Ava realized that her house now stood like a stage, and that everything both offered and exacted performance. She invited him in because the kindest lies are sometimes the simplest. She could not, in that moment, refuse a man who wore his awkwardness like modesty, any more than she could refuse a child who wanted a toy. Hospitality is the slow bridge between two people's necessary economies. She offered him tea as if bringing a man into one's kitchen is the same as offering admission to one's ledger. The next hours would be careful, clipped, full of the small measures people use when staging civility around unknown variables. Doha carried his own awkwardness into the room like a cloak, and his fingers fumbled in ways that made repair work, fixing a kettle, tightening a screw, breathe with new meaning. He watched the baby with the intensity of someone cataloging a new species. Faces are foreign maps to those who were not born into them. He learned the geometry of carrying Essie so as not to wake her. He dropped into the household with the slow, determined steps of someone acquiring the grammar of belonging. But the house remembers differently than a ledger. It remembers in textures and habits. It noticed how Doha tilted his head in certain lights, and how his hands, when he reached for a spoon, seemed to search for the right curvature as if reacquainting themselves with the idea of domesticity. It noted the faint flake of green that fell from his sleeve as he warmed his hands by the hearth, moss, or the trace of something like it. and it filed that away among the other small anomalies it had catalogued. Ava watched him with a bristle of fear that was also a strange, thin tenderness. She had made bargains. She had kept them. Now she found herself in the position of having received an unexpected arrival that might undo or recompense what had been traded. There were moments when she felt like a woman standing at a crossroads, the weight of earlier promises in one pocket and the soft rise of new care in another. She thought of the note in her drawer and of the elders on their mountain. She thought of the chewing of objects and the small cruelties of bills. She thought with a ledger's sharpness of what forgetfulness might spare and what it might take. When Doha asked in the hush between midnight and the slow ring of the kettle, "Do you hate me?" The question landed like a small stone in a pond, sending out ripples that shook the frames of pictures. His voice had the simplicity of someone trying to name his own requirement. He had not yet learned the cunning ways of society. His question was direct, and it was also a small human plea. Ava took that question like a hand that had been offered at a dance she could not yet learn. She could have said many things, conveyed social niceties and the official posture of a woman who had regained her footing. Instead, she felt the mail of truth. She had anger, yes. She had fear, yes. She had the odd, private knowledge of what she had given and what she had not been able to measure. She had survived by trading her voice, and a man had come to the house for reasons that braided into that survival. Her answer trembled, honest and messy, the way only the most necessary confessions do. She said that she was angry at being compelled to barter her own speech for the life she wanted, angry at the neatness with which favors slipped under thresholds and changed rooms without anyone taking responsibility. She said she was afraid of what was bought and asked and what remained unpaid. Yet she also said that she could not find the moral currency to call the man at her hearth evil. He had, after all, worked to earn bread. He asked for nothing that would undo the child's care. The words arranged themselves as a trade between truth and tenderness. She did not hate him for being what he was. She resented the bargain that had made him necessary. There's no neat catharsis in such conversations. They rearrange things, not repair them. The burning of the note in the little metal sink later that week, an act Ava performed with trembling fingers, felt like both exorcism and denial. The flames ate the paper, and for a moment Ava believed the subtext of the act, that one might erase obligations by destroying the tokens that named them. Yet ashes are only the proof that something burned. They do not undo the arithmetic of debts, nor do they return the cost paid in sleepless nights and whispered agreements. Doha stayed. He brought his hands and his readiness to learn. He mended a child's high chair, and in that repair, learned the physics of smiles. He carried Essie in a way that made Ava step back and admit, privately and with a sudden small gratitude, that there was a kind of gentleness he had been given which could not be fully accounted for by the gold parcel. He laughed at the coffee grounds that spilled in the morning and learned the order of the morning rituals as if they were prayers. The house slowly shifted. Its creaks softened into a language the three of them could inhabit. A baby's bell breath, the scrape of a chair, the small crash of a spoon. Curtains continued to move sometimes in the way curtains do when a draft finds an old seam, but the movements no longer read as ominous so much as narrative punctuation. Neighbors' stories smoothed into a new narrative. Ava had found someone helpful, someone unremarkable who fit into the household as neatly as a repaired drawer. But the forest did not leave him wholly. There were nights when Doha woke with the sense of moss under his nails and could not place the recognition. There were times when, in the shop, the sound of someone breaking a plate would send a reflex through him that had nothing to do with human commerce but everything to do with an old way of swallowing. He kept his list-making as a small devotional act, the way others might keep a prayer book. He wrote down names, things he must not lose, the name of Essie's favorite lullaby, the route to the bakery, the face of the woman who paid him the week he had no coin. He also kept, folded in a shirt, a scrap of green moss, as if touch could anchor the past into the present. The pact, whatever its origin, had become a complicated seam through which the household's fabric ran. Money had come, and settlements had smoothed out the immediate edges of ruin, But what was left to negotiate was not bank balance but belonging. Ava had what society would call saved face, yet inside she held a thin litany of small angers, at being compelled, at the theft of a naming she had once believed she owned. Doha had been given form and had taken wages and chores, but he had traded a language of river and root for being called by a name at a table where someone asked, "Would you like more stew?" This is where the world waits. In the slow seconds after decisions, and before their consequences settle into habit. It waits with a house that listens, and with a man who learns how to fold laundry, and a woman who measures her debts in breaths. There are tasks to be done, lists to be made, a tree to plant in soil that receives both rain and rumor, a child's hand to be taught the geometry of tying shoes. Memory will continue to be an island with tides. The elder's bargain has not been broken, only lived with. Outside, the rain had faded to a mist that threaded the street lamps like a suggestion. Inside, Ava folded another of the tiny knit garments beside a photograph and felt the familiar double ache of gratitude and caution. She stood by the window and watched the curtain rise and fall. The house had begun to breathe the way humans do, some days easy, some days tight. It wanted the ordinary forms of repair, and in that wanting there was also the work of belonging, a steady, repetitive labor that asks for patience rather than miracle. Doha cleaned the kettle that night with a devotion that had the shape of prayer. He kept his moss nearby and a list in his pocket. He dreamed of coils and rivers sometimes, and woke not knowing if those dreams were memories retreating or new habits of longing. He had a name now, one that fit his tongue, and a place at a table. That was more than he had asked for originally, and it was less than he had expected in other ways. The story would not be settled by a single gesture. There would be tests yet. Neighbors who pry, bills that stubbornly insist, nights when the house remembers differently than the heart. But for the first long while, the house learned a new rhythm, the small human music of cups clinking, of Essie's breathing like a bell, of a man learning the tempo of being owned by nothing more than belonging. Outside the window, the garden waited for the first shovel to be put into earth for a tree. Inside, the gold scrap was now only a memory in the hollow of a drawer. The elders' terms had traveled far to find their meaning in a kitchen where mending kettles and tending a child's nap were the closest things to sacrament. Ava folded linens and tried to catalog her feelings in the same careful way she had learned to catalog bills. Doha sharpened a spoon with a file and felt a small satisfaction in a job well done. If there is one truth in such arrangements, it is that belonging is accomplished through the dull mortar of ordinary days. The pact had been strange in its origin and unromantic in its mechanism. It had saved a household from ruin and sent a creature turning toward humanity. But it had not dissolved the cost. Forgetting came in measures. Memory persisted like moss in hidden seams. Repair, not miracle, would be the currency by which this life would hold. Night deepened. The house exhaled and then settled to a sleep that was not quite silent but well contained. Ava watched her child at last with a kind of soft approval that had been earned in a ledger of small, consistent mercies. Doha lay on the couch he still found too small, and traced with a finger the shape of a seam in the upholstery, feeling for a place where he had slipped in and not yet been wholly mended. There were roads yet to travel, a confrontation with rumor, a test that would ask whether love could bear the awkwardness of an origin, a tree to plant whose roots would anchor rather than wander. For now, the pact hung between them like a line on a ledger, acknowledged but not yet fully balanced, and the house listened, as houses do, to the sound of three people learning to be less lonely under its roof. There were seasons of testing that came like weather, and others that came like rumor. The weather turned first. Spring arrived with a slow insistence, damp earth that softened the garden, days stretched thinly into new light. And the house did what houses do in wet weather. It amplified small sounds until they seemed larger, as if the roof wanted to make sure everyone inside was listening. Curtains lifted and settled. The floorboard by the nursery offered a complaint now and then. A faucet, fixed by Doha's careful hands, began a nervous little drip that made the kitchen sound like a distant rain. Neighbors took note. They are creatures with good memories for spectacle and poor patience for complication. The story the polite world prefers is trimmed at the edges. a philanthropic secret revealed in a parcel, a socialite with renewed standing, a quiet handyman tucked into a household like a nuance. Gossip bent toward the tidy version. At market stalls and over hedges, the narrative compressed. Ava's misfortune had been solved. An anonymous helper had done what friends and funds could not. People do not like to hold long, uncomfortable thoughts. They find them heavy and prefer the flatter, lighter stories that settle easily into banter. But rumor has weight. It gathers small facts and rearranges them into sharper instruments. A woman in a neighboring lane with a mind for intrigue noticed that Doha arrived at the garden at dawn and sometimes carried saplings. She remarked over tea that the man was peculiar, a useful creature perhaps, but more a tool than a companion. A letter, unsigned but carefully phrased, found its way to the household. A plea couched as concern about propriety, a suggestion that Ava might consider what reputation cost against convenience. It landed on the hall table like a small, precise ingot of frost. Ava read the letter with her father's pencil tapping a rhythm in her palm. She had learned to translate remarks into arithmetic the way others read faces. The implication, "Do not let what saved us become the thing that ruins us," was not new to her. It was the ledger rendered in social code. She folded the note and placed it in the drawer with the gold scraps ashes, 2 relics of bargains, one burned and one folded against the dark. She felt the old itch, the impulse to hide, to perform, to smooth edges so conversation would not tilt the house into exposure. Her father came to visit that week, summoned by the polite fact of a tea and a careful invitation. He arrived in his habit of precise observations, a glance at the mantel, a comment about the sound of the clock, the economy of his words as he asked after accounts and the baby's weight. He listened, and he watched Doha as a man watches a ledger apprentice. Doha, who had learned to measure the world's kindness in coin and in the weight of a satisfied customer, stood with his hands at his sides and offered the kind of unobtrusive service the tradesman uses: quiet, practical, direct. "You mend?" Ava's father asked, less curious than willing to quantify a skill. He had always respected competence more than stories. Doha nodded, his manner boxed in courtesy. "I mend what is broken. I take a wage for it." Her father tested him with practical questions, the ones that require details rather than feeling. Where did he learn his craft? Who had hired him before? Was he steady? Answers came in the form of small narratives. The shop that had taken him on, the week he saved enough to buy a proper file, the morning he had walked home in the rain and found a coin in the gutter that paid for a loaf. Her father's eyes softened at the mention of steady work. A man who knows how to earn a living is half a country's worth of security, he thought, the way older people think. Ava watched the exchange with the watchful patience of someone who had learned to value both impression and fact. She did not expect her father to understand the moral arithmetic of name and voice. He lived by balances and columns. But she wanted him to see what she saw, a man who had come and who did not demand exemption from human tasks. She wanted him to meet the gentleness that sometimes admits itself awkwardly into rooms. Her mother arrived the next day, bringing with her a casserole and a way of looking at small things that was a kind of medicine. She noticed the way Doha carried Essie as if measuring breath and weight and instinct had inched their way into him. Her mother had the skill of the hearth and the patience to watch someone learn to hold a small human. She smiled in ways that did not demand explanation. Her acceptance was not a certificate. It was the kind of welcome that smooths a place at the table. Neighbors in small clusters began to see him differently. The woman who had first speculated about a utilitarian worker noticed that Doha had taught Essie a game of hiding and found her laughter honest. Another neighbor watched him plant a row of lavender along the path and remarked to a passerby that there was a steadiness to the man that did not announce itself loudly. Gossip shifted slowly, like sediment settling in a bowl. It did not vanish, rumor never does, but it adjusted into marginal notes that the public might read around rather than through. Still, not all tests come in the polite shape of visitors' opinions. Crisis arrived as it so often does, small and sudden. One afternoon, Essie, who had a mind for exploration and the accurate hunger of the very young, slipped a gate when Doha had turned to fetch a dropped glove. Doors are easy to misjudge. A child's curiosity is harder to anchor than a ledger entry. For a moment the world narrowed to a single aperture. Essie outside the gate and the garden spreading like a puzzle of hedges and puddles. Doha's first movement was a map of reflexes drawn from an older way of being. He ran, but not only with human speed. Something under his ribs kept his balance in the wet, and his eyes, trained by hours of watching small things on benches and riverbanks, read the hollows where a child's shoe might catch. He found Essie by the pond's edge, not because he had remembered a route written by elders, but because his body recognized the sound of small feet and breath, a pattern familiar in more than one world. He scooped her up without thinking of reward. He only thought of the heat of her body and the hollow of her neck and the urgency of returning her to safety. Ava, who had been speaking with a neighbor, heard the shout, a wordless note of alarm, and turned to see Doha arrive, Essie in his arms and her blanket crumpled. For a beat, Ava's chest decided the shape of everything. Relief sprawled into her first, unplanned. Then something more complicated threaded through, gratitude tangled with a remembrance of the bargain, a sense that the man who had taken risks she could not name had also, when the house's small order sloughed off, been the one to gather her child. Neighbors watched the tableau as if it were a small play. There was a murmur of admiration and a mutter that might have been suspicion. A daunt murmured that a man who knew the way of the water is perhaps useful after all. Another voice asked whether a woman who keeps company with unusual people might find her position tempered. The social balance tilted, and then found a new, precarious poise. After that day things altered. The incident with the gate became a point of conversation that was not quite praise and not quite condemnation. For Ava, the incident rearranged certain anxieties. It made tangible the fact that Doha's old wildness, though tempered by the ritual and by wages, had not been erased. It suggested that the old and new in him could intersect in ways that mattered, that wildness was not only hazard, but resource. She began to see his past as a seam, sometimes fraying, sometimes useful when mended. Doha, too, experienced shifts. That night he sat with mud on his elbows, and Essie's damp hair still smelling of rain curling against his cheek. He thought, in a way that had less to do with words now and more to do with held shapes, of the mountain's lip and the elder's object. He touched the moss in his pocket, the talisman he had not yet permitted himself to discard, and felt the smallness of certain debts. He had traded a language that once let him move in shadows for one that required him to stand in light and answer when someone asked for a reason. In that exchange there were days of grace and nights of unrecognized longing. Memory, like a tide, had its own schedule. There were mornings when an old instinct rose up in him unbidden, his hand reaching for a branch when in the city there were none, a word in a dream that tasted of river silt, a reflex to slip into the dark where the city's edges blurred. And there were bright, short pulses of belonging, the smoothness of a child's hand in his, the way a repaired kettle sang when heat was applied, the gentle respect in the customer's eyes who returned with a broken teapot and found it whole again. These newer pleasures did not wash the old away, but they collected in him like a new layer of sediment, one that could be walked upon. Ava had her own reckonings. The ledger in her head kept adding up details that did not exist on paper. Nights of restless sleep returned, but now the reasons were layered. Some nights she dreamed of the bargain as if she had signed in another ink. Some nights she woke with the vivid sense of strangers' eyes. She kept watching Doha, sometimes with gratitude and sometimes with an ache that resembled mourning. Mourning for what, she could not always say. Not entirely for a life she had never lived, but for the sense that something of what had been traded would not return to her in the way she expected. She had her child's safety. She had a companion who learned the rhythm of kettles. She still had the knowledge that some part of the world had been asked to step through a threshold it had not chosen to cross. Small acts continued to build the architecture of daily belonging. Doha took to buying the bread on certain mornings and arranging the crusty loaves in a basket he had repaired with sinew and a practiced patience. He became adept at the child's lullaby, his voice rough where the words caught, but steady enough to coax asleep. He learned to tie Essie's shoes, his fingers fumbling at first, until his muscles found the memory of the loops and the way a child's fingers needed space to escape. Ava watched him in these kindergarten tasks and felt the slow erosion of her sharper feelings into something softer and more pragmatic. They planted the tree on a cool afternoon after the mist had lifted. Ava's mother suggested a small ornamental pear that would flower in early May, something the child would learn to identify as she grew. Planting a tree is an ordinary act that holds the force of a promise. Something will rise over time and take root beneath the renovations of rumor. The whole household came out, Ava with a spade, Doha with a nervous pride at the way his hands could hold earth in a human way, her father with his sensible hat, the maid smoothing the hem of her apron. Neighbors gathered beyond the gate out of curiosity, faces leaning toward the small ceremony like branches seeking sun. A short circle of polite applause followed the last tamp of soil. Ava knelt and pressed her palms to the earth, feeling its cool generosity. Doha stood behind her and, without pomp, placed his hand over hers. His hand felt calloused and warm, a hand that had learned the geometry of mending. It was a small gesture. It was also a small promise, a willingness to be planted in a place not merely for convenience, but with the daily work of tending. Ava's father, who had been reluctant at first, found himself moved by the industry in Doha's hands. He remarked, not unkindly, on the man's steadiness. "A fellow who will plant a tree will see it through," he said, the kind of sentence older men offer as testimony. It was less than full acceptance and more than dismissal. Her mother squeezed Ava's shoulder in a way that told a story about households versus headlines. In the weeks that followed, the household seams knit slowly. Doha's lists remained a fixture, tiny notebooks pocketed with the names of errands and reminders, the grammar of survival in ink. He wrote down Essie's favorite games, the time the bakery opened, the number of the man who mended umbrellas. He also wrote things that belonged more to habit than need. The name of a stream he could not quite recall, and a fragment of an elder's chant that surfaced like a forgotten tune. He kept moss in a tin beneath his shirt, a green scrap that smelled of rain and mountain and memory. He touched it sometimes and drew courage from its dampness. The Pact's more subtle cost did not stop at domestic labor. It reached into the quiet of Ava's social life. Invitations arrived with a different flavor now. Some were offered as if nothing had shifted. Others came with the careful distance of those who measure social currency differently. An acquaintance mentioned in passing that Ava's life had undergone an interesting chapter, a word that held both pity and a hint of relief. The household story, like all household stories, would be simplified in public. The private ledger, what was traded and what remained, would be contained in the drawers of the people who had made or endured the bargain. There were nights when Doha's forgetting made small cruelties. He would, in a startled moment, forget a name he had only yesterday learned and feel a flush of humiliation. Once, in a grocery, he could not recall what a plater looked like and reached for the wrong item, baffling the clerk. These errors were not malicious. They were the small stumblings of a mind rearranging itself. Ava learned, sometimes with patience, and sometimes with an impatience she could not wholly disguise, to remind him without shame. The relationship shifted into a pattern where one taught and the other practiced, one confessed anger and the other accepted correction. They taught each other the human arts of apology and of continuing without score. If there was a moral center to the menage, it was not a neatness, but an accumulation of the ordinary. Doha took up paying his share of bills. He bought a second-hand watch that kept time with surprising steadiness. He learned the ways of the laundress and, in his spare evenings, sat repairing dented spoons for neighbors who left their broken pieces in a basket by his shop. The economy of service returned to him rewards that were not the gold-wrapped favors of strangers, but the modest, reliable warmth of a community that noticed and repaid kindness with kindness. Rumor continued, of course. A letter of complaint arrived from someone who mistook Doha's origin for a scandal to be matters of morality. It suggested that certain arrangements were indecorous, that the house could be compromised. Ava read it with a fatigue that had become familiar, the fatigue that comes when sociality demands constant performance. She folded the complaint into the same drawer as the gold scrap and the ashes of the burned note. The pile of relics did not go away. It simply became part of the domestic furniture, a small cabinet of inconvenient truths. There were small triumphs, too. Essie learned to say Doha's name with a particular slur that made it sound like a song. When she toddled and laughed at a newly learned game, Doha laughed in a way that was entirely human, tearing and honest and without the old reserve. Ava noticed once that when Doha watched their child sleep, he had a look in his face that belonged to a parent learning how to be present. It made her think of all the ways belonging arranges itself, not in declarations, but in bedside vigils, in the way one shortens a sentence to respond to a restless cry in the night. An old woman from down the road, one of those people who exist at the margins of stories and sometimes know the richer truths, stopped by with a bag of bread and a remark. "You don't fix everything with a single stroke," she said, not unkindly. "Sometimes you mend by doing the same small thing again, darning a sock, folding a sheet, tending the sapling." Ava heard in that sentence the sum of what had been building. It was not miraculous gift that held them, but repeated attention, the daily, often invisible labor that creates continuity. Doha had moments of fear, too. Once he dreamed of the mountain with a clarity that made his palms sweat, elders around him, the taste of the object in his mouth. He woke with an ache in his jaw, and for a day moved as if he expected something to be returned to him without warning. It was then he realized that forgetting had an order that was not his to command. Some things receded, some remained lodged like grit. He could not call back everything he had given away when he bit down on the elder's object. He lived with the residue of both kinds of life. On the anniversary of Essie's birth, the household enacted a small ritual that felt like an inheritance and not like a concession. Ava suggested they mark the day by inviting a limited number of neighbors and serving tea from the repaired pot that Doha had mended in the first winter. The event was not ostentation, it was a seam binding. People came and chairs arranged themselves. Children spilled crumbs and someone mispronounced a name. The party was short, domestic, and accurate in its modesty. A neighbor offered a comment about how the house had a different sound now, less a chest of sympathies and more a place that contained its own ordinary noise. Ava felt pleased and a little exposed. Doha smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he held in his chest a small, private gratitude. There was no closing scene where the bargain was annulled or the old life restored. There was no last-minute miracle that removed the cost Ava had borne or that returned Doha entirely to the mountain. Instead, there was the slow accumulation of habit, the kettle cleaned and the bread bought on a Tuesday morning, the list added to and erased, a child's boot set by the door. The gold parcel remained a story told in the kitchen sometimes, an object of curiosity folded into the narrative of the family. Its presence did not vanish as if by shame. It remained a thing to account for, like a ledger line with a complicated annotation. Years, in small increments, turned the extraordinary into texture. Essie grew, learning the name of the garden's pear tree and the cadence of a family that could hold both secrets and ordinary acts. Doha's memory kept its peculiar tides. He would sometimes recall, with an ache and a surprise, the sound of water over stones, or a name of a creature he had loved in another life. He would often reach, hand unconsciously to the moss tin, and in those small touchings, a continuity was preserved that was not retrieval, but dedication. He bound a ribbon, no gold, around the tin and kept it in a drawer for reasons that were part superstition and part habit. Ava, whose life had once been measured in invitations and columns of charity, learned to count differently. Her social victories felt less important now than the small victories at home. A repaired hinge that stopped a door from sagging, Essie learning to feed herself without making a play of it, a neighbor offering a loaf without comment because Doha had fixed her lamp. She kept her ledger still, some urges do not leave people, but its margins had softened. Where previously she might have marked a favor as a credit with a precise date, she now spent evenings cataloging the small way someone had taken up part of a load and lightened it. There was a different kind of accounting that measured in kindness and task rather than in columns of currency. The house, which had been an actor from the beginning, settled into a gentler role. It still remembered in textures. Curtains lifted sometimes, but now they read like punctuation, a breath placed at the edge of conversation. The The stair creaked with the weight of bodies moving through lives that were joined by unremarkable commerce. The clock kept its time, hesitant at odd intervals but otherwise faithful. Its hesitations no longer felt like warnings. They were the pauses of a life that included both wear and repair. And the strange pact, still strange in the way strangers make bargains, hung in their lives like a seam, visible if one looked closely. It did not define them entirely, nor did it evaporate into some easy moral. The companion at Ava's side was more than anyone had imagined at the outset. He was not a creature of myth now, nor a perfect human. He was a man with a pocket of moss, a hand that learned to steady a child's drink, a memory that stumbled and surprised, an economy of work that paid for bread and repaired kettles. He was more than his origin, and less than the forest had once held him to be. He belonged in the way belonging must be earned, by repetition, by tending, by the persistence of ordinary care. On a late afternoon that carried the smell of rain and of the pear tree in blossom, the three of them sat at the kitchen table drinking weak tea. Essie, now a child with scuffed knees and a fine impatience, moved her spoon in an exact, determined circle. Ava watched the movement and felt a small, settled pleasure that had been purchased by many unpaid tensions and several acts of courage. Doha, his fingers stained lightly with oil from a morning's work at the shop, told a small story about a gentleman whose watch would not keep time. Ava's father, visiting out of habit and affection, laughed at a detail that had to do with a misread inscription. The house listened and answered with the soft domestic music it had learned to hold. They were ordinary people in a house that had once been a stage for a strange parcel and a whispered bargain. They were not absolved, nor were they triumphant in any mythic sense. They were living the consequence of a decision and the practice of repair. The pact had been the beginning of a series of adjustments, of grief and gratitude, of forgetting and remembering, of work and lullaby. The companion at Ava's side had more within him than the gold parcel suggested, and both the household and the town would keep telling versions of the story that suited their comfort. If one were to read the ledger of this life, entries would read unevenly. Bargains struck in the dark that saved a household, afternoons when a man learned to tie a child's shoe, nights spent waking to the same small breath. There would be charges not easily balanced, memory lost in increments, longings that had nowhere to go, and credits in the form of steady hands and the smell of bread. The account remained open. When the evening came and the curtains lifted one last time into the soft wind, Ava looked at Doha and saw the outline of a person who had stepped from a different world and learned the cost of staying. She saw in him not a miracle nor a monster, but a companion whose otherness persistently threaded through the domestic fabric. She thought then, as the house made itself small and sure around them, that the strange pact would always have a place at the center of their story. It had begun with a gold parcel and a promise written like a threat, and it had become, over the slow work of days, a life that demanded both gratitude and vigilance. They drank their tea, and Essie fell asleep with her head on her mother's lap. Doha rose and smoothed the blanket with hands that had learned both the precision of repair and the steadiness of a new kind of care. The house exhaled. Curtains settled, a clock ticked with less hesitation, and the pear tree stood in the garden, a small, patient promise sprouting green. The strange pact of a socialite had brought a companion who was more than anyone thought. In the end, what remained was not a tidy moral, but the steady maintenance of belonging, repair, tending, and the repetition of small mercies that build a home. If this portrait of the ordinary touched you, if you like stories that sit between the everyday and the uncanny, please like and subscribe for more tales like this.